On the morning of October 14, 1943, the airfields of eastern England were already alive long before sunrise. Floodlights cut through the fog as ground crews moved with practiced urgency, their breath visible in the cold dawn air. Parked along the runways were 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses, four-engine bombers that embodied America's faith in technology, altitude, and industrial power. Nearly 3,000 young American airmen climbed aboard that morning, many of them barely out of their teens, bound for a target deep inside Nazi Germany, the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. None of them could forget what had happened the last time they went there. 2 months earlier, in August 1943, the 8th Air Force had attempted the same mission. That raid had turned into a nightmare. German fighter pilots, alerted early and reinforced throughout the flight, attacked in relentless waves. Bombers were ripped apart in midair. Crews watched friends vanish behind curtains of flame and smoke. 36 bombers were lost, and hundreds of men never came home. Survivors returned shaken, describing skies so crowded with enemy aircraft that gunners fired until their ammunition ran dry, still unable to drive the attackers away. That memory hung over the airfields now, heavy and unspoken, as engines roared to life once again. Yet Schweinfurt remained on the mission board. To American planners, ball bearings were not just industrial components, they were pressure points. Every tank rolling across the Eastern Front, every fighter lifting off from a Luftwaffe base, every submarine prowling the Atlantic depended on them. Destroy Schweinfurt, the theory went, and the German war machine would grind itself to a halt. The cost, however terrible, would be worth it. Strategic doctrine had already answered the moral question before the crews ever strapped in. As the bombers lifted off and formed up over England, the climb began. The fortresses rose steadily, spiraling upward toward their cruising altitude. Below them, fields and rivers shrank into a gray blur. Above them waited something far more dangerous than flak or fighters. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside the aircraft plunged toward -50 degrees Fahrenheit. By 30,000 feet, it dropped even further. The B-17 had no insulation, it had no pressurization, it had no heating system beyond what each man carried on his own body. The aircraft was little more than a thin aluminum shell between life and an environment hostile to human survival. Inside, the cold announced itself immediately. Frost began creeping across the interior walls and windows, blooming like white veins of ice. The men's breath condensed inside their oxygen masks, sometimes freezing solid and clogging the airflow. Sweat from the climb turned into ice against their skin. Metal surfaces, gun mounts, ammunition feeds, control handles became dangerous to touch with bare hands. Even a moment's contact could peel skin away. The bomber had reached an altitude that planners believed meant safety, but the men inside were discovering that altitude had its own way of killing. As the formation crossed the European coastline, German radar stations detected them. Fighters scrambled from airfields across occupied territory. The first attacks came sooner than expected. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slashed into the bomber stream, firing cannon bursts that tore through wings and fuselages. Black flag clouds erupted around the formation, each explosion sending shards of steel ripping through the air. Bombers shuddered as shells detonated nearby. Some aircraft fell out of formation trailing smoke, easy prey for fighters circling like sharks. By mid-morning, the skies over Germany had become a battlefield layered in altitude. At lower levels, flak batteries fired until their barrels glowed. Higher up, fighters attacked from head-on, exploiting the brief moments when bombers had the least defensive firepower. Gunners fired until their fingers ached, then fired some more, their gloves stiffening as ice formed in the fabric. In the ball turrets beneath the aircraft, men crouched in spaces barely large enough to breathe, surrounded by cold plexiglass and roaring wind, knowing that if power failed, escape might be impossible. Aircraft after aircraft went down. Some exploded instantly, torn apart by cannon fire. Others limped away from the formation, only to be finished off minutes later. Parachutes blossomed in the distance, drifting slowly toward captivity. In other cases, there were no parachutes at all. Crews fought fires, patched holes, and dragged wounded men away from ruptured fuselages, all while maintaining formation discipline demanded by doctrine. Falling out of position could doom not just one bomber, but many. When the formation finally reached Schweinfurt, the factories below were obscured by smoke and defensive fire. Bomb bay doors opened, letting in an even greater blast of freezing air. Bombs fell toward their targets, thousands of pounds of high explosive released in carefully calculated patterns. For a brief moment, the mission's purpose seemed tangible, almost triumphant. Then the bombers turned for home, and the most dangerous part of the flight began. German fighters, conserving fuel and ammunition, attacked relentlessly on the return leg. Crews were exhausted, ammunition was low. Injuries that had seemed manageable earlier now worsened in the cold. Blood froze, fingers stiffened beyond movement. Men slumped at their guns, refusing to leave their posts even as sensation vanished from their hands and feet. The discipline that kept formations intact also kept wounded men standing long past the point of safety. When the surviving bombers finally staggered back to England, the scale of the disaster became clear. 60 B-17s had been destroyed. More than 100 others were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Over 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or captured. Airfields that had been full that morning now had empty dispersal pads where aircraft should have been. Medical crews rushed aboard returning bombers expecting shrapnel wounds, and burns and found something else entirely. Hands that could not unclench, feet that had turned white, then black. Skin that had frozen solid beneath electrically heated suits that had silently failed hours earlier. Men who had survived flak and fighters now faced amputations, not because of enemy fire, but because of the cold. The mission would go down in history as Black Thursday, one of the darkest days in the annals of American airpower. Official reports focused on aircraft losses and bomb damage assessments. Strategists debated whether Schweinfurt had been worth the price. But buried beneath those numbers was another reality, one that did not fit neatly into after-action summaries. The men had not only fought Germany that day, they had fought the sky itself. Before we go any further, if you're finding this story compelling, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It genuinely helps more people discover these untold histories, and it allows stories like this to be told in full, without shortcuts. Because what happened on Black Thursday did not end when the last bomber landed. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a crisis the Army Air Forces did not yet fully understand. In the weeks following Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force began assembling its casualty reports. Columns of numbers tracked aircraft lost, crews killed, men missing in action. These figures were familiar, expected, and grim. But buried in the medical summaries was another set of statistics that did not fit the established logic of air warfare. Men were being removed from flying status in alarming numbers not because they had been shot, burned, or wounded by shrapnel, but because their bodies had simply failed in the cold. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Between late 1942 and December 1943, 1,634 American airmen were permanently or temporarily grounded due to cold injuries sustained on combat missions. During the same period, fewer men were removed from duty because of direct wounds from German fighters or flak. The implication was staggering. The environment at altitude, something planners treated as a background condition, was disabling more aircrew than the enemy itself. At 25,000 feet, the B-17 did not merely fly through cold air. It existed inside an Arctic environment. Outside temperatures regularly plunged to -40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the aircraft, the situation was only marginally better. The bomber's thin aluminum skin offered no insulation. Heat from engines dissipated long before reaching crew compartments. Every mission turned the interior into a wind tunnel of freezing air, drawn through open gun ports and gaps around hatches and seams. To compensate, crews were issued electrically heated flight suits, a marvel of engineering on paper. These one-piece garments were threaded with wires and powered by the aircraft's electrical system. When functioning properly, they provided enough warmth to prevent frostbite even at extreme altitude. Training manuals described them as reliable, proven, and essential. But combat exposed a flaw that testing had never revealed. The suits failed quietly. A wire would snap somewhere inside the fabric. A connector would loosen under vibration. A circuit would overload when the bomber took damage. The result was not dramatic. There was no alarm, no warning light, no immediate sensation of danger. One moment a man was warm, the next the heat simply stopped. By the time the cold was felt, damage was already beginning. Certain positions inside the B-17 were especially vulnerable. Waist gunners stood beside open windows cut into the fuselage, their guns protruding into the slipstream. At cruising speed, a 200-mile-per-hour blast of air poured into the aircraft, carrying the full force of the stratosphere with it. Even with a functioning heated suit, the cold gnawed relentlessly at exposed joints and fingers. When heating failed, frostbite could set in within minutes. Below them, the ball turret gunner occupied the most extreme position of all. Encased in a 4-foot-wide sphere of plexiglass and metal, he curled into a fetal position, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around twin machine guns. There was no room for bulky clothing, no space for spare gloves or boots, and most critically no parachute. Escape depended entirely on electrical power. If the turret froze or lost power, the gunner could be trapped, unable to rotate back inside the aircraft. When heating systems failed, these men froze where they fought, yet they did not abandon their posts. German fighter pilots quickly learned that attacking from below exploited the bomber's weakest defensive arc. The ball turret existed to close that gap. If it was unmanned, the aircraft became vulnerable not just to damage, but to destruction. Gunners understood this instinctively. Many endured excruciating cold in silence, gripping frozen gun handles with hands they could no longer feel because leaving their position might doom everyone aboard. Some never realized how badly they were injured until hours later. When bombers landed back in England, ground crews noticed men moving stiffly, awkwardly. Gloves would not come off, boots seemed glued to feet. Medical officers discovered hands locked into claw-like shapes, fingers bent permanently around triggers they had gripped for too long. In some cases, surgeons had to cut gloves away because the skin beneath had frozen to the fabric. Frostbitten tissue, once thawed, turned black and necrotic. Fingers were amputated, toes followed. Flying careers ended quietly, without medals or headlines. Officially, these men were listed as non-battle casualties. The designation was misleading. There was nothing accidental about their injuries. They were the direct result of how the air war was being fought. Every mission reinforced the same truth. Altitude was not merely a tactical choice. It was a physiological gamble, one that relied on equipment functioning perfectly under conditions it had never been designed to endure for hours at a time. Yet missions continued without fundamental change. Briefings still emphasized flat patterns and fighter tactics. Crews trained to bail out of burning aircraft, not to recognize early signs of cold injury. Heating suits were repaired and reissued, their flaws treated as unfortunate anomalies rather than systemic failures. Commanders viewed cold injuries as individual misfortunes, not as indicators of a deeper problem in doctrine and design. Meanwhile, the men adapted as best they could. Some layered newspaper inside their suits for insulation. Others wrapped scarves around oxygen hoses to prevent ice buildup. Waist gunners took turns stamping their feet and flexing their fingers whenever combat allowed, trying to force blood back into numb limbs. Ball turret gunners memorized the exact sequence of movements needed to escape quickly, just in case power failed. None of these measures were official. All of them were acts of quiet desperation. The irony was cruel. The very altitude meant to protect the bomber formations was turning them into instruments of slow injury. Fighters and flak were visible enemies. The cold was invisible, silent, and relentless. It did not care about bravery, discipline, or doctrine. It punished mistakes instantly and endurance gradually, hour after hour, mile after mile over hostile territory. As casualty numbers grew, whispers began circulating among medical officers and flight surgeons. Something was wrong. This was not bad luck. It was not isolated equipment failure. It was a pattern of systemic breakdown that threatened the sustainability of daylight strategic bombing itself. But acknowledging that truth meant questioning assumptions at the heart of American air power, and questioning doctrine in wartime was never easy. Somewhere between the frozen gun positions and the heated offices where strategies were drawn, a reckoning was approaching. One that would force the Army Air Forces to confront a dangerous possibility that the aircraft they trusted to win the war were slowly destroying the men inside them. The suffering endured by American bomber crews over Europe was not the result of oversight or bad luck. It was the predictable outcome of a doctrine built on technological optimism and a faith in altitude. Long before the first B-17 crossed the English coastline in combat, the theory had already been written and it left little room for the human body. In the mid-1930s, when Boeing engineers designed the Flying Fortress, they were solving a strategic problem, not a physiological one. Military planners feared massed bomber losses to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The solution seemed elegant: build an aircraft that could fly higher than most enemy interceptors, carry its own defensive armament, and protect itself through formation firepower. The higher the bomber flew, the safer it would be. Altitude, in this view, was armor. The aircraft performed exactly as intended. The B-17 could cruise above 25,000 feet, with a service ceiling exceeding 30,000 feet. At those heights, early German flags struggled for accuracy, and fighter engines gasped for power. In theory, tight bomber formations would form interlocking fields of machine gun fire, making frontal attacks costly and rear approaches suicidal. Daylight precision bombing would replace blind night raids. Industry would be destroyed systematically. The war would be shortened. What this theory ignored was simple, brutal biology. At 25,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to roughly one-third of that at sea level. Oxygen is scarce. Temperatures plunge far below what the human body can tolerate without protection. Exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Even fully clothed, a man depends entirely on artificial systems, oxygen delivery, electrical heating, insulation to remain functional. If any part of that chain fails, injury follows quickly and often permanently. The B-17 carried 10 men, scattered across a long, narrow fuselage with no internal quarters linking all positions. Heat from engines dissipated rapidly. There was no centralized climate control. Each crew member lived inside his own microenvironment, defined by proximity to open gun ports, electrical outlets, and thin plexiglass panels separating him from the stratosphere. Some positions were survivable, others bordered on lethal. Tail gunners sat alone at the very rear of the aircraft, isolated from the rest of the crew. If their oxygen failed, no one could reach them in time. Waist gunners operated in constant wind, exposed to freezing airflow that turned every mission into a test of endurance. Ball turret gunners, suspended beneath the aircraft, depended entirely on electric motors to rotate their turret back inside the fuselage. A power failure could trap them, forcing the rest of the crew to land knowing a man was still locked below. Engineers had not flown these missions. They tested equipment on the ground, in controlled environments, for limited durations. Heating suits were evaluated individually, not under sustained combat vibration, electrical damage, or freezing airflow. Designers assumed redundancy would compensate for failure. They assumed malfunctions would be rare. They assumed the human body could endure more than it could. Combat proved otherwise. As mission after mission returned with frostbitten crews, the discrepancy between doctrine and reality widened. Reports from flight surgeons described injuries that should not have been possible if equipment functioned as designed. Yet the aircraft continued flying at the same altitudes, in the same formations, with the same systems. The doctrine worked strategically. Bombers reached targets, bombs fell on factories. But the price was being paid quietly by the men who survived. Some commanders dismissed cold injuries as unavoidable. War was harsh, sacrifice was expected. Others viewed them as maintenance issues: improve wiring, issue better gloves, repair suits more carefully. Few were willing to confront the deeper implication that altitude itself, the cornerstone of daylight bombing theory, might be fundamentally incompatible with sustained human performance. The men had no such luxury. Crew members learned to measure missions not in miles, but in minutes of numbness. They learned the exact sensation that preceded serious frostbite: a deep, aching cold followed by frightening absence of pain. They learned to fight through it anyway. Gunners tied ropes to their wrists to prevent losing grip if fingers failed. Navigators stamped their feet until toes screamed, then went numb. Pilots clenched control yokes with hands that no longer obeyed fine movement, praying they would regain feeling before landing. No one wanted to be the man who left his position. The culture of bomber crews was unforgiving. Survival depended on everyone doing their job, no matter the cost. A frozen gunner could still fire. A frostbitten navigator could still plot a course. Reporting cold injury risked being grounded, replaced, left behind. So men endured in silence, trusting that they could make it through one more mission, one more freezing hour above enemy territory. Behind the scenes, however, concern was growing. Medical officers noticed that the same injuries appeared again and again, regardless of experience or training. Veterans were just as vulnerable as newcomers. The cold did not care how many missions a man had flown. It attacked the young and the seasoned alike. Slowly, reluctantly, a realization began to take hold. The aircraft were performing as designed, but the design itself was incomplete. It took someone who understood both combat and medicine to articulate that truth clearly. Before we go further, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps this channel reach more people who care about the real human stories behind history, and it allows these narratives to be told with the depth they deserve. Because the next phase of this story does not begin in the sky, but in the mind of one man who recognized the danger before the institution was ready to admit it. While bomber crews battled freezing air over Germany, one man watched the casualty lists with growing alarm. To most commanders, the numbers were unfortunate but abstract statistics to be filed and explained away. To Colonel Malcolm Grow, they were unmistakable warning signs. He had seen this pattern before, in another war under different skies, and he knew exactly where it led. Grow was not a theorist sheltered behind a desk. In 1915, long before aviation medicine even had a name, he volunteered as a surgeon with the Imperial Russian Army during the First World War. On the Eastern Front, he operated in primitive conditions, often under artillery fire. He treated frostbite, shock, infection, and trauma on a scale that left lasting impressions. Soldiers did not just die from bullets, they died from exposure, exhaustion, and systems that failed to protect them. For his service, Grow earned Russian decorations for bravery, but more importantly, he gained an understanding that most military planners lacked. War punished the body as much as it tested courage. After returning to the United States, Grow dedicated his career to a new and largely ignored field: aviation medicine. Flight, he understood, was not simply a mechanical challenge, it was a biological one. Altitude altered oxygen availability, circulation, cognition, and temperature regulation. Pushed the body beyond its limits, and no amount of discipline or bravery could compensate. By the time the Second World War began, Grow was one of the very few officers who combined frontline combat experience with deep medical expertise in flight physiology. As reports from the 8th Air Force crossed his desk, the truth became unavoidable. Men were being injured not because they were careless, but because the system they operated in was hostile to survival. Frostbite rates climbed with each month of sustained high-altitude operations. Amputations followed. Crews were quietly reassigned or discharged, their losses absorbed without fanfare. Official summaries categorized these injuries as non-battle, but Grow understood the deception embedded in that term. These men were casualties of doctrine, not accidents. Grow began gathering evidence. He spoke with flight surgeons. He reviewed mission logs. He examined injured airmen firsthand. The stories were consistent: heating suits that failed without warning, oxygen systems that iced over, crew positions that offered no protection from the cold. Most damning of all, these injuries occurred even when crews followed procedures perfectly. This was not a training problem. It was not a discipline problem. It was a design problem. The resistance he faced was immediate and predictable. Admitting the scale of the problem meant questioning the foundations of daylight strategic bombing. It meant acknowledging that aircraft celebrated as engineering triumphs were also flawed environments. It meant confronting the uncomfortable reality that planners had prioritized performance envelopes over human endurance. In wartime, such admissions carried institutional risk. Resources were limited, production lines were already strained. Changing equipment or procedures mid-campaign was expensive and disruptive, but Grow persisted. He reframed the issue in terms the military could not ignore. Cold injuries, he argued, were not merely medical tragedies, they were operational failures. Each grounded airman represented lost experience, lost cohesion, and lost combat effectiveness. Crews were not interchangeable. Training replacements took time. Frostbite was quietly degrading the fighting strength of the 8th Air Force at a rate no enemy action could match. Gradually, his arguments gained traction. Improved heating systems were developed. Electrical wiring in flight suits was redesigned for greater durability. Better insulation was added to critical areas of the aircraft. Oxygen equipment was modified to reduce icing. Most importantly, altitude profiles and mission planning began to incorporate physiological limits alongside tactical considerations. The changes did not happen overnight, and they did not eliminate risk entirely, but they marked a turning point. The environment inside the bomber was finally being treated as a weapon system in its own right. For the men who had already suffered, the recognition came too late. Fingers were not restored, careers were not recovered. Many returned home carrying injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives, often without public acknowledgement. Their sacrifices did not appear in victory parades or headline statistics. Yet their endurance forced the institution to confront realities it could no longer deny. The legacy of that reckoning extended far beyond World War II. Modern military aviation, from pressurized cabins to climate-controlled cockpits, from redundant life support systems to rigorous human factors engineering, owes much to lessons learned the hard way over Germany. Every advancement in crew survivability traces back to moments when the human body reached its limit and refused to be ignored. Black Thursday and the months surrounding it revealed a truth that reshaped air warfare. Technology could extend reach and power, but it could not erase biology. The sky itself was an adversary, indifferent and unforgiving, demanding respect on its own terms. This was not merely a story of bombers and targets. It was a story of men who endured an invisible enemy long enough to force change, men who fought not just Germany, but the limits of human survival, and in doing so, transformed the future of flight.